Welcome to 3 Books with Neil Pasricha, where each chapter we uncover and discuss the 3 most formative books of an inspiring individual. We believe books change lives, and that's why we are the only podcast in the world by and for book lovers, writers, makers, sellers, and librarians. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to play catch with a pig's bladder. That is a quote from Gretchen Rubin from the chapter of 3 Books that you were just about to listen to. And it's probably my favorite line. It just made me laugh so hard. I want to play catch with a pig's bladder. You'll have to guess which book made her say that and why rereading that book kind of reduces stress and anxiety for Gretchen sometimes. But who is Gretchen Rubin? Who is Gretchen Rubin? You know what? She is the author of so many New York Times bestsellers, books like The Happiness Project, Better Than Before, and The 4 Tendencies, which is her newest, which I loved. And she sold over 3 million copies of those books. That's a lot of books. That's a lot of books. Now she's the host of an incredible podcast called Happier by Gretchen Rubin. She hosts that with her sister, Elizabeth Kraft, and it's already scored over 40 million downloads, probably even more by now. Gretchen's amazing because she has an incredible lens on human nature. She looks at the world through a really unique set of eyes. You're going to hear her set of eyes as this show progresses. She studies the world. She's got the kind of, I don't know what it is. It's almost like she looks at things, she studies them, and then she just alters her behavior. She tests it, and then she like tries it out, and she reports back. And you're going to hear, for example, in this chapter, a book that completely changed how she eats, like overnight. She woke up one morning, she's like, all right, I'm not eating any of those foods again, ever. Like, she just completely changed overnight. How did she do that? What does that mean for her family? What does that mean for her friends? How does everybody around her react? It's fascinating to learn and to understand. This is a dynamic conversation. I am actually really lucky that Gretchen still takes my calls because these days, she hangs out with Oprah and the Dalai Lama and she's the question to Jeopardy answers. But I met her so long ago before the Happiness Project or the Book of Awesome had even come out. You're going to hear how we met. And when we talk about how we met, you're going to hear a very frustrating thing in this show where I talk about a quote, she talks about a quote, and neither of us read the quote. So if you stick around till the very end, I will read you the Bertrand Russell quote that we are actually talking about at the end of the show. Now, before we get into it, just one final reminder. We record every chapter of the show in a special 2-ear format. Why? Because we want this to feel intimate. We want it to feel like 3 people on a couch together. I'm one of those people. You're one of those people. And my guest, in this case, Gretchen Rubin, is one of those people. So you'll hear me coming out of one ear, or one side of your car, or one side of your speakers, and Gretchen coming out of the other. We picture you in the middle of the conversation. We think of it as, how do we touch on together the biggest life themes of all, contentment, anxiety, ambition, how do we live great lives? 3 Books is all about that. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. So let's get right into it and let's live a few more lives together. Well, I am sitting on the 14th floor of the Penguin Random House offices in downtown Toronto in the middle of a blizzard with my good friend Gretchen Rubin here finishing up her whirlwind Canadian tour for her new book, The 4 Tendencies. Gretchen, thank you so much for sitting with me in this crazy, weird boardroom with no windows. We can't even see the snow.
Yeah, but we've got posters of books, so we're happy. Yes, we're in our element. Yes, it's so fun to be sitting down to talk with you about my favorite subject.
I'm so glad.
Books.
And I thought, we could start the conversation by going all the way back to 2009. Mm-hmm. Because on August 2nd, 2009, as you may or may not remember, you wrote this blog post. I'm going to hand you a piece of paper right now.
Oh, I love this quotation.
Okay,
yes.
Do you want to? It's a Bertrand Russell quote.
Yes, from his autobiography.
About collecting eggs. And if you notice at the bottom of your post from happiness-project.com originally,
yes.
what you said?
Yes.
What is this? Someone sent me a link to 1,000 awesome things. Don't know who, but thanks. And here you put this link in. So I got flooded with this bunch of traffic on my blog, 1,000 Awesome Things. I believe this was before the Happiness Project book came out in December of that
it would
year.
have been. Yep.
Book of Awesome had not come out. And so I sent you this email.
Oh my gosh, this is like, this is so cool. I wish I'm not as good with my...
Well, I dug into my old Gmail
cool.
archives on my old 1,000 Awesome Things at Gmail account, and I found my first ever email to you.
Wow.
And your kind, less than 24 hours later response, where we then trade phone numbers and start talking. And
oh my gosh.
for the last
Can
year...
I keep this and like look at it again?
Yeah,
like,
of course,
read the whole thing? Oh my gosh.
I've got
so
a
fun.
lot of email strings between us from those
that's-
two accounts that we probably neither of us use much anymore. And it was amazing because you know, as bloggers, we're putting ourselves out there. We got our email addresses, and you came to Toronto. We had dinner a number of times, and this all culminates in today us talking about your 3 most formative books. And so we had a brief conversation before this conversation where you indulged me a little bit and you gave me them. And so I was hoping we could go through them one by one.
Great.
In chronological order. Is that okay?
Sure.
Or do you want to go chronological by your life? Is this okay?
This is fine.
Okay.
Whatever.
Okay. So the first book that you feel is your most formative is The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin by Benjamin Franklin.
Yes.
You know, he lived 1705 to 1790. We know him as one of the founding fathers of the United States. You know, even just reading up on him before this, I didn't really quite realize he was such a polymath, being an author, a printer, a politician, a postmaster, a scientist, an inventor, a humorist, a statesman, a diplomat. And the interesting thing about this book is it's written in the last 20 years of his life, but was not published until 30 years later, in 1818, by his grandson, William Temple Franklin, for the first time in English. Also, according to Wikipedia, is the first ever American book to be taken seriously by Europe.
Oh, interesting.
That's what it says.
Well, he had quite a profile in Europe, so that's interesting.
So take me back to the time in your life when you read this book.
Well, I read the autobiography of Franklin because I love autobiographies and memoirs, and so I had read it. I had read it in the past, but what often happens to me, and I don't know if you experience this, is like I'll read a book and I'll love it, but for whatever reason, then I will be interested in a certain subject, and so it becomes interesting to me in a new way, so I read it through a different lens. So there's many books that I've read many times because it's sort of like each time I'm kind of looking for a different thing. And so one of the things I love about Benjamin Franklin and why I read it for the second time or maybe even the third time was if you're interested in something like a happiness project, Benjamin Franklin is your patron saint. Because
Totally.
this was a guy, he's like, here are the 13 virtues, here's my chart, I'm gonna give myself a check, like this is what I want, you know, I'm gonna meet with my friends and we're gonna work on these things together. Like he's a really like, let's figure out a system, put it to work. And he's also hilariously funny, which people who are aiming for moral excellence, you don't necessarily think that they're going to be funny. So I appreciated that. And also I love epigrams, teaching stories, koans, aphorisms, proverbs, anything like that. And of course, Benjamin Franklin, as Poor Richard, is one of the earliest American kind of promoters of proverbs, because Poor Richard's Almanac was full of kind of all these wise sayings. So in many, many ways in my own writing, Benjamin Franklin just speaks to me. And as you say, he was just such an extraordinarily creative and productive person. He did so much good in the world that it's just exciting to read his account of it.
And why do you like biographies so much? What is it about them?
Well, you know, partly they're often, you know, very well written, and that's nice. But, you know, part of it, I think, is, you know, my subject is human nature. And like I wrote this book, The Four Tendencies, and people were like, well, how did you research it? Because it's not like you can go look it up in the card catalog because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So part of what I'm always doing is trying to observe people and look for patterns and see people doing things. And so biography is one way to do that. Memoir is one way to do that, where you're like, well, why, you know, people do the strangest things, and how do you explain it? How do you think about it? So it's just, for me, it's a kind of research, and it's, in a way, it's a frustrating kind of research because I can't look it up because I don't know what I'll find. And often many people wouldn't even necessarily remark on the things that I would find notable in a book. So I just have to read widely and hope that I get lucky in finding something that's going to strike a chord with whatever I've got in my head.
It's so interesting you say that about biography and memoir being such a window and reflection onto ourselves, because I was talking to somebody at Audible recently. He's like, what we're seeing, or at least I don't want to speak on behalf of the whole company, but he's like, what I'm seeing is a slight decline in the largest category in the bookstore, self-help, and a slight uptick in memoir. And what we're kind of hearing is customers or readers saying, it's a better reflection onto my own life to read about your life than simply a prescription for how I should do things differently.
Well, and I've definitely found this, like in my own writing about happiness, if I'm telling you what you should do, well, it's very easy to say what you should do. You should definitely do this. You should definitely do that. This is what, it's very easy, and it's like it comes will just flow off your tongue. But when you're like, okay, what am I going to do? Can I try that? Like a million people will tell you to meditate, and I'm the one to be like, well, I've tried it twice and it doesn't work for me. So do that with that what you will. But when I try to do it myself, I find something very different. Or like everybody says, moderation is pleasant to the wise. If you're trying to, cut back, just give yourself half a dish of ice cream. Just have it a little bit. Follow the 80-20 rule. And that makes perfect sense on paper. But when I tried that, I found I can't do that.
Yeah.
I can't have a little. I can I can have none.
Yeah.
Or I can have a lot, but I can't have a little. But the only way I knew that is I tried it. But if I was just trying to give you advice, I would say, oh, you should follow.
You should definitely do it.
You should do it because like, well, that sounds so smart, right? And so I feel like, and that's one of the things about Benjamin Franklin is he tried it all himself. He was doing it all himself.
Yeah.
Like he's talking about how to be industrious. Well, he figured out how to build the habits that would allow him to have this kind of industry and how he could shape his circumstances so that he would achieve his aims. And so I feel like he's not only offering good advice, but he is exemplifying good advice. So you're exactly right. And
it's funny because you say I tried meditation twice, it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And people like me are drawn to that because I'm like me too, and it doesn't work. I can't just go to my basement, turn up the chant, sit in the lotus position. Do you feel like the landscape as a whole on this category that we're both in is shifting right now? I look at books like The Subtle Art Not Giving a Fuck. I look at that whole like it's like this works, this doesn't, but I'm going to be open about this. Tim Ferriss's human guinea pig kind of stories. Is the world's trend in this type of dialogue evolving? Right now?
That's interesting. I guess I haven't thought a lot about it as a category, other than to notice that like picking a funny word from like a foreign language and like, oh, this is like a cool hygge or whatever. It was. That seems to be
book of hygge.
Yeah, that's a trend. I don't know. Every book that I write, like I feel like I have to write it in the way that best suits that particular subject. So I haven't done enough really to step back and think about what's going on generally. But that would be an interesting exercise to do.
There's something about radical authenticity these days that are just, we want to see the warts more. We want to see, you were just on one of my favorite shows, City Line, and they do this episode called The Real episode where they don't wear makeup.
Yeah.
And they do this, and it's an interesting trend.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about that a little more. Well, that's a great reflection on your book from 2 centuries ago. So let's use that to your book from 1 century ago, Little House in the Big Woods.
Yes.
That's your second book by Laura Ingalls Wilder, released by Harper in 1932, an autobiographical children's novel. It says at the back, wolves and panthers and bears roam the deep Wisconsin woods in the late 1870s. In those same woods, Laura Ingalls lives with Pa and Ma and her sisters, Mary and baby Carrie, in a snug little house built of logs.
Yeah.
And so this is the first of 9 books in the Little House series, released over the next 10 years, based on her own memories of her early childhood living in the big woods of Pepin, Wisconsin, which I know is today, I looked up the population today, 793. Oh, yeah. So still kind of woody there.
Yeah.
And tell us about how this book shaped you.
So this was one of the first books that I remember taking in as a book. So I remember my father reading to me, and also it was one of the first books that I could read to myself, like a proper chapter book. And one of the things
How old were you?
I don't know how old I was. I was a pretty late reader, interestingly, given how obsessively I read now. But one of the things that was very funny is when I could read myself and my father was still reading aloud to me, I would see how he would skip words. I don't know if you've ever done that with your children, but you're like, okay, I'm going to just like skip. And they'd be like, ooh, you missed this. Ooh, you missed that. So I busted my father. I remember that very clearly. But this was one of the first books, and I was obsessed with Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. I had a dress that I called my prairie dress. Every year for Christmas, I would get a different, the next hardback book, from my parents, and I still have that collection. Wow. Plus, I have a backup collection of the paperbacks because I can't have just one set of Laura Ingalls Wilder books. It would just be too risky to run out. And so each one I've read 1,000 times. And I think the cover of one of them is falling off. And so this is a book that's important. And one of the things I will say about Laura Ingalls Wilder is that if you haven't read them since you were a child, or if you've never read them, you really should read them because they are such masterpieces. And if you read them as an adult, you will get more out of them because you bring more to them. And so you will see things that as a child, it's like when I read them now, I see things that I did not see as a child. So I'm enjoying it in a different way as an adult. So it works on many levels. And another thing about Laura Ingalls Wilder that is fascinating and that no one has really done is as the main character Laura grows, the books become more sophisticated. And so you are in her mind and you're seeing how her thinking is becoming. Like the Little House in the Big Woods, it's very much like we live in a house.
She's 5 years old in the book.
We live in a house that's, and there's a pumpkin in the attic and my doll's name is Charlotte. And, and it's all told in the third person. But then by the end, it's, seeing deeply into motivation and, the complex, seeing a lot more complex. But this first book is just poetic in its simplicity and it's beautiful, beautiful book.
I mean, I would never have stumbled upon, like you told me, you said it was one of your most formative books, so I picked it up, I read it, and the whole book felt like, that statement, picture's worth 1,000 words. It felt like the 1,000 words of a picture of living. There was not really a complex plot. No one surprising really
it's just
comes
like
by.
What,
it's just like we put wood chips in the tree, we smoke them,
but it's so satisfying, right? You're like, oh my gosh, I want to play with a pig's bladder. I'm going to get one piece of candy, and it's like their minds are blown.
I might use that as the title for this podcast. Oh my God, I want to play with a pig's bladder. You're right, because it's very vivid on the hunting stuff.
It's very vivid. And it's interesting because a friend of mine is British, and he said that, he had never read these books as a child, and now he's a big person in book publishing. And he said he was astounded by the mastery of the book, how well it was done, and also he said that he felt like it gave him such an insight into kind of like the American way of mind,
pilgrimage.
This kind of this pioneer mindset, and what it was to be alone in the big woods, and like in like the little store, and so it's a really and the beautiful illustrations from Garth Williams are just breathtaking.
And how did it shape the way you write today at all?
Well, I would love to think so in some way, because as you say, I mean, what's interesting is how powerfully how vivid everything is, how you're so, in the moment. So I don't know. I wish, but maybe just from reading and rereading compulsively something that's so beautifully written, I hope it kind of trickled in.
And you said you've read them thousands of times. How
I will tell you how much I have read them. So my daughter listens all the time to audiobooks. And so we have the Cherry Jones version of reading the Laura Ingalls Wilder. Cherry Jones is amazing. These are amazing books.
What's Cherry Jones?
Cherry Jones is the reader. She for the audiobooks of Laura Ingalls Wilder books, of all of the Little House books. And Cherry Jones is an amazing. I first was like, who could possibly be the voice of Laura Ingalls Wilder? And then I was like, okay.
Cherry Jones
can. But one of the books was on and she was reading and I'm like, I think there's a word wrong there.
No way.
I think that's a different word. And I looked it up and it was a different word.
Do you remember?
No, I don't remember what it was.
You could hear in...
Yeah, I was like, I don't remember that word. I was like, I know that book pretty well.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I have one reader of my books that you won't find this maybe surprising, maybe not, maybe you have the same for your books, who emails me about once every 2 years to tell me a copy editing mistake in one of my published books.
Really?
That skipped through all the editors that skipped through. Like, she's like a U for Laura Ingalls Wilder for me.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I'm always humiliated.
I know, it's
and
but you're
satisfied.
Like, oh gosh, why do you point that out? Because now it's just going to leap out of the page for me, that missing space.
But that's how much you read them. And so, and is there not to belabor this, but like, are you going through anything as middle-aged Gretchen today that will provoke you to pick that up, this book? Or is there an impetus when you're like, I feel like I need the book? Or what draws you to it, and when in your life are you pulling towards these young adult,
Well, I'm a huge fan of children's literature and young adult literature generally.
Yeah.
So I read it all the time. I'm in 3 book groups where we talk about children's literature and young adult literature. Is there anything pulling me toward it? Maybe partly it's the power of memory because I have read them so many times.
Yeah.
But I think they're just so good.
Mm-hmm. And it's all of them, not just the first. This is the first.
Well, I have my favorites, and like if I'm throwing it down with another Laura Ingalls Wilder fan, we'll talk about like, what do you think about On the Banks of Plum Creek? You know, that one is not quite up to snuff, and like I don't like the fact that. But then somebody said, oh, it's all about the railroad, and then I'm like, oh, of course I understand. It makes perfect sense.
These are like going way over my head.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I'll have to catch up to you.
Yeah, no, they're so good.
And I love that. Okay, so we're doing this is 3 books. You know, you gave me one book that was published in 1818, another one that was published in 1932, and the last one. On your third most formative book is Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It by Gary Taubes. Come out from Knopf Doubleday, I'm probably saying Knopf wrong after all these years of reading it and never saying it, in 2010. So Gary is a writer for Science Magazine. He does this incredible history, like scientific-based history of the calories in, calories out movement and why it's totally flawed. Super, I thought, left-brained book. The back of it says, building upon his critical work in Good Calories, Bad Calories, and presenting fresh evidence for his claim, Gary Taubes revisits the urgent question of what's making us fat and how we can change. What drew you to this one?
So this is a book that I picked up because my sister is a type 1 diabetic. And so I'm very interested in insulin, which of course is the life-saving hormone that all type 1 diabetics are dependent on. And for their very lives.
Of course.
So it's like high stakes. And so but I didn't know that much about insulin. And so I was in a bookstore and I was just like flipping through this book. It's a provocative title, Why We Get Fat.
Yeah.
And so I read it not because I particularly wanted to lose weight, but because I saw that it was all about insulin. And this was something that kind of always in the back of my mind is like, I should really like learn more about the function of insulin because of my sister.
Elizabeth
is a type 1 diabetic. And but I had this crazy experience, which is why this was so formative. So I was like on vacation with my in-laws and my family, which is something that we do every year. And I think this was 4 or 5 years ago now. And it was just like in the bag as one of the books that I packed for vacation. And I read it. And overnight, I changed everything about the way I ate. I found it so utterly convincing, so compelling, that I was like, I am just going to change except for eating like chicken and leafy green vegetables. Everything changed about the way that I ate. And because I was just so utterly persuaded by his arguments about the role of insulin, the role of carbohydrates and fat. Yeah. And the fact is, everything he says in the book basically is not controversial because everybody insulin is very, very well understood. It's been known for many, many decades, and its purpose and in the body is pretty well understood. And I was just like, this explains so many things that have puzzled me over the years. I'm just gonna try it.
And it's such an analytical, research-based point of view. There's no pictures of food in here. There's no menus.
Yes,
it's like let's start from 100 years ago and talk about what happened and why this got.
And the basic argument, if you want the nutshell version, is the role of insulin in the body is it's like the storage and release of fat. If you're more likely to gain and retain fat if your insulin is high. And the thing that raises insulin is eating carbs. So if you don't eat carbs, your insulin will fall, and then you'll be more likely to burn fat. And it's like, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to try it. I remember the first day that instead of having like my bran cereal and my skim milk for breakfast, I ate like scrambled eggs and bacon. And I'm like, I hope Gary Taubes is right because I'm like giving it a shot. And it just had an amazing effect on my body in every possible way. And So it was, but one of the things that was funny about this was, if you look, because then later when I was writing my book Better Than Before, which is all about habit formation, the thing that was weird is I was always trying to understand, how do you explain how people change habits? Yeah. And usually what the tradition, back to what we were saying earlier, if I'm going to tell you what to do, Neil, what you need to do is make incremental change. Yeah. Don't you try to do anything that's too abrupt. Try to do maybe you'll substitute this for this and try that, these things. Yeah. And I didn't do that at all. I changed everything overnight.
Like overnight?
Literally overnight. Like literally, I went to bed, woke up the next morning, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to put this to work and let's see what happens. And so in my book, Better Than Before, I call this the strategy of the lightning bolt, which is like, and it doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's super powerful, which is when you just get a new idea, a new realization, and you're just like, and then your habits just automatically change. Like, oh, I have to quit smoking because my baby was just born and I can't have my baby in a house full of cigarette smoke. Overnight. Like somebody who has struggled for years could find it easy.
Yeah.
Because just that one realization. So, because I was sort of puzzled. How did I do that?
Yeah.
Like, it just changed everything. I mean, like, I don't eat sugar. And I mean, I don't eat sugar. I don't eat flour. I don't eat rice. I don't eat starchy vegetables.
And we're in a conference room where you and I were both given a really nice lunch about half an hour ago by the kind people at Penguin Roundhouse. They brought me a hamburger on a white bun and a salad, and they brought you a hamburger patty on lettuce with a Diet Coke.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you look right behind me, I didn't
the
eat
bun
my.
is there.
You know why I left the bun? It wasn't because I saw yours and I was like, I want to be a Gretchen. It's because I read this book.
Yes, because it's so compelling.
It's so
right?
compelling.
You're like, oh my gosh, why am I eating?
But the
this
thing for
bread?
me, and this I don't know if it affected you, is like, you know, my wife Leslie, she's like, are you not going to eat my mashed potatoes? Like last night, she made this delicious dinner, roasted chicken with the vegetables and the mashed potatoes, and I'm kind of feeding them to the baby on the side. She's like, you ain't eating my mashed potatoes, and I'm thinking, did it affect things with your family or going out for lunch with friends? Like, how did you sift it in that way?
Well, this is where, like, you know, I say I'm an upholder. One of the ways that being an upholder in the Four Tendencies is helpful is I'm sort of like, well, I got to eat this way because, you know, I don't care if you feel like it's kind of weird because I'm like, I'm just not going to do it. So it didn't affect me that much. I think some people feel much more self-conscious about what they're eating, or they feel more out of step, whereas it doesn't really bother me to be out of step. It's interesting to see how it's affected my family. And again, in Better Than Before, I talk about the strategy of other people because we're constantly trading habits with other people. I don't make a rule for my children that they can't have sugar or sweet. They have tons of sweets. They eat bread. They eat pasta. Partly because I'm worried about the whiplash, you know, that if you make it too forbidden, then people like kind of go crazy. Yeah. But it's definitely true that just because in my household, I'm like, well, I don't want to go to a restaurant that really serves mostly pasta because I'm not going to eat pasta. Right. Or, you know, I'm like, well, you could get that if you want, but I don't want any bagels because I don't eat bagels. Like slowly over time, like my husband now is basically very low carb too. He's just slowly changed. And even my children, like my 12-year-old is like, oh my gosh, I would never have, you know, like a whole order of French fries. Like to her, she's like, yeah, you would have a few French fries, but would one person eat a whole order of French fries? Like that's kind of like crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy talk. So
I'm so happy you put this book in here because it would, to that point about being self-conscious about food, like it's rare for someone to say, hey, a formative book for me was this book on diet and nutrition, but it really is life-changing. And having read it, again, I wouldn't have, but I did. I'm like, I'm feeling inside me the compulsion to be shifting because the book is so compelling.
Good.
So to wrap things up, because it's such a great conversation with you, I know we could always talk for hours. I thought we do this like little fast money round, if you don't mind,
great.
to kind of close things
fun.
up.
Yes.
Okay, so I got 4 kind of quick questions for you, Gretchen, as we close off our conversation about books. You and I love books so much. So number 1, how do you organize your books?
If I have a book that I've written, I keep all the books that were source books together, and then otherwise it's alphabetical by author, divided between fiction and nonfiction and biography. Which is,
I love it. I
have my children's literature collection is separate.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I'm Dewey Decimal, so I'm looking for other ways to do it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this is good. Number 2, what is your favorite bookstore?
Crawford Doyle was the one right near my house. It just closed. Rainy Day Books is my hometown bookstore, which I love.
Where's that?
Rainy Day Books is in Kansas City, Missouri. Corner Bookstore is an excellent bookstore in New York City.
Anything that makes it special? Rainy Day or
just
Corner?
Going all the time.
Yeah.
Happy memories.
Good curation.
Yeah.
Well, and do you have this third question? What is your white whale book, or a book that you've been wanting to read forever, but you may not have? You haven't got to it yet.
Well, I even own it because I bought it, called The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. It's a super famous book. It's extremely long.
Is it about melancholy?
It's about melancholy, yes.
And you write about happiness.
Yeah, no, I'm like, I should read this book, but I'm like, yeah, that's my white whale.
Okay, that's funny. I don't know if he's alive. I'm typing.
Oh no, it's an old book.
Oh, written in 1621. Hey, that would add a new century to our conversation of going back 3 centuries.
Yeah.
And my last book is, you know, we haven't talked much yet right now in this conversation about how successful and prolific you have become. But there's many people listening to this right now who are aspiring writers or who are writing their first book. What would be the 1 or 2 nuggets of wisdom or advice you would share backwards to your younger self or someone just starting out?
Oh, I always say the same thing to myself or to anyone. The most important with writing is to have something to say. If you really think about what is it that I want to communicate and like how can I communicate that idea clearly, that's when ideas flow. And when I realize whenever I'm struggling, it's because I'm just like blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that doesn't work. Nobody wants to read that. I can't write that. And so it's always like, what is it that you're trying to say? And then words come much more easily.
I love it. Thank you for your time today, Gretchen. It's great to see you,
it's
and
so
I really
fun to
appreciate
see
you coming
you.
on the show.
Thank you.
Okay.
So much fun.
Take care. The most important thing with writing is to have something important to say. Sounds so obvious, but it's probably a lot more difficult than it sounds. It's just me. It's just Neil again, back in this tiny, invisible antechamber talking to you. That was a great conversation with Gretchen Rubin. And did you find it as annoying as I did when I was re-listening to it, where I was like, hey, check out this Bertrand Russell quote about collecting eggs. And she's like, yeah, it's a great quote. And we don't even say the quote. And like I said at the beginning, I promised you I would read the quote. So on August 2nd, 2009, if you were surfing over to Gretchen-Rubin.com, as you know, I think it was happiness-project.com, my apologies, you would have bumped into this Bertrand Russell quote. Here it is. In solitude, I used to wander about the garden, alternately collecting birds' eggs and meditating on the flight of time. If I may judge by my own recollections, the important and formative impressions of childhood rise to consciousness only in fugitive moments in the midst of childish occupations and are never mentioned to adults. I think periods of browsing during which no occupation is imposed from without are important in youth because they give time for the formation of these apparently fugitive but really vital impressions. That is a quote by Bertrand Russell from his autobiography. That is the blog post underneath which Gretchen wrote, "A kind reader sent me the link to the blog 1,000 Awesome Things. Excellent." Classic Bill and Ted type of declaration there. But that's what introduced us to each other, and that's where this entire conversation, this chapter 5 of 3 books, even came from almost 10 years later. So, I think it's a beautiful kind of reflection on sort of the power of relationships and the power of the internet, certainly, over time. And now, if you've made it to this far in the podcast, I'd like to welcome you to the end of the podcast club. The end of the podcast club is one of 2 clubs we have for 3 books. Number 1 is this one, the one at the end of the podcast. Number 2 is the Secret Club, which I cannot say more about, but there is a secret way you can enter into that club. Again, I can't really tell you too much, other than if you call our phone number, you might get a little clue. The phone number, of course, is 1-833-READ-A-LOT. 1-833-READ-A-LOT. And actually, with that, let's go to the phones right now.
Hi, Neil. My name is Jim, and I am calling from Cleveland, Ohio, in the U.S. I just finished listening to your podcast with Seth Godin, and I got to tell you, I'm normally somebody who subscribes to podcasts that I can listen to in my commute, which means about 20 minutes long. And when I opened this up and I looked at something that was an hour and 54 minutes, and I just thought, really? But I started listening to it, and I really got into it. It was so intimate. You and Seth having this great conversation. I'm a fan of yours. I'm a fanatical fan of Seth Godin's. And you just made it so personal and fun. And I was astounded at how quickly an hour and 54 minutes just flew by and how much value I got from that conversation. So forget the 20-minute thing. If you keep them all this fascinating, this interesting, this provocative, I am going to remain a huge fan of this podcast, and I am already feeling way overwhelmed with the volume of quality titles that I am accumulating to read. I'm going to have to start being selective myself. Thank you for the stimulation. Thank you for the intimacy of your podcast. And I look forward to more for the next several years.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jim from Cleveland. I so appreciate those warm and kind and touching words. It's so true about length, isn't it? I'm the same way. Like, I look at a podcast, I'm like, is this going to be worth my time? And I know some people do the 1.5x or 2x and they listen to it at fast speed. And that's great if you do that and your brain actually can catch up. But for me, I want the conversation to be as long as it is. So this conversation with Gretchen was quite a bit shorter, right? I think the chat with her was only 25 minutes or 30 minutes of the total length of the show. And the one with Seth Godin went a lot longer. And you heard me in that show saying to him a couple times, like, I'm conscious of time. And he's like, go ahead, take as long as you want. So it's really a compliment to him. And sometimes if the conversation gets a level deeper, we keep it running because all of us, you, me, Seth, we're in it together, right? We're going somewhere that you can't go in 10 minutes or 20 minutes sometimes. That doesn't mean we'll always get there. It doesn't mean we'll always get there, but it means that I will always try. You have my promise and my guarantee that my real goal on the show is to really touch on the hugest themes we could possibly touch on about how we all live great lives today. So thank you so much for the call. I so appreciate that. And thank you for saying several years. I did the math. The last chapter of 3 books is going to actually air at 5:52 a.m. on September 1st, 2031. I'm not kidding. September 1st, 2031. So we got almost 14 years trucking along together. That will get us to 333 chapters for 1,000 formative books total. Okay, that is our goal. That is the giant vision for the show. So thanks for the call. By the way, if you want to leave a call, if you want to leave a message, like I said, it's 1-833-READ-A-LOT. I listen to every single one, and we always play one on the show. The other thing we do on the show is, of course, play and read our review of the chapter. So this chapter's review of the chapter was sent to us over iTunes by someone named Kel78Bell, Kel78Belle. By being the review of the chapter, Kel, you win a signed copy of any book. Just drop us a line to prove that it's actually you, and I'll read your review right now. It says, the best review I can leave is that I've shared this show, 3 books, with several of my book-minded friends. I feel like I have a diverse collection of podcasts, but I enjoy those most that challenge me and give me something to consider or learn or feel connected. I started experimenting by having my cell phone in black and white based on the episode 1 with Frank Warren, and I've had people comment on it, so already the podcast is connecting with me in unexpected ways. Thank you. Well, thank you, Cal78Bell. I really appreciate it. It's so hard to get reviews for podcasts. So if you are listening and you'd like to have a chance to win, or if you want to just sort of do a kind of nice karma thing for us, we'd love a review of the show. Like I said, we read all of them, and we read one of them on every single chapter. And another thing we've been doing on the show is experimenting with the word of the chapter. So do you remember near the beginning of the conversation when Gretchen had this phrase regarding Benjamin Franklin? She was like, yeah, I love koans, epigrams, aphorisms, proverbs. Hear that other word there? Koans? Koans? What is a koan? I had no idea what a koan was, so I guess I just pretended to know for the conversation. I couldn't Google it. I was like, Cohen? Is it Kone? No, that's an escalator company. I couldn't figure it out, so I emailed Gretchen. I was like, what is a koan? She wrote back, it's Koan. It's a Zen thing. So I went on to Merriam-Webster, found there is a word called koan, a Koan. Okay, it's a paradox to be meditated upon that is used to train Zen Buddhist monks to abandon dependence on reason and force them into gaining sudden enlightenment. Koan. And if you just type koan into Google, there's an even kind of shorter definition, which says a paradoxical anecdote or riddle used in Zen Buddhism. Koan. So, okay, you're probably like, well, what's an example then? So I kind of found this example that I could read to you. This is an example of a koan. Are you ready? Here we go. Tanzan and Aikido were once traveling together down a muddy road. A heavy rain was falling. Coming around a bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, unable to cross the intersection. Come on, girl, said Tanzan at once. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud. Aikido did not speak again until that night when they reached the temple. Then he could no longer restrain himself. He said, we monks don't go near females, he told Tanzan, especially not young, lovely ones. It is dangerous. Why did you do that? I left the girl there, said Tanzan. Are you still carrying her? That is an example of a koan, Koan, this chapter's word of the chapter. So, we covered a few things there. We got that nice call from Jim. We've got the review from Cal. We've got the little word of the chapter. And so I'm going to say so long. I'm going to say farewell. I'm going to say keep in touch. If you like this conversation with Gretchen, please check out her work. She's at Gretchen Rubin on all the social media channels. Say hi to both of us on Twitter if you want. I'm at Neil Pasricha. She's at Gretchen Rubin. If you want the show notes, if you want links to all the books she talked about, all the things she mentioned, the quotes, the articles, everything, it's all live at 3books.co. 3books.co. Not .com, just .co. And until next time, you are what you eat, and you are what you read. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep turning the page.